Welcome to The View, where recruitment, marketing and society comes together.
We all know the NHS is facing unprecedented challenges. We all rely on it. We've all got friends and family who work there. But what if I told you that the NHS is actually a leader in diversity and data-driven recruitment, and the outlook is actually pretty rosy? I'm chatting with Hannah Foster today, who's a Chief People Officer within the NHS, and she's got some really interesting and reassuring insights for all of us. So listen on to find out more. My name's Neil Armstrong from TribePad. This is The View, where people, recruitment and purpose come together. Hi, Hannah. Thank you very much for speaking with us today. I'm chatting with Hannah Foster, who's Chief People Officer at Royal Devon University Healthcare NHS Foundation Trust, which is quite a mouthful. Hannah has worked previously at Flybe, Church of England and Pearson, so has a wealth of experience across public, private and third sector. And I'm guessing that the NHS is really challenging right now. So Hannah, firstly, thank you for joining us.
It's an absolute pleasure, Neil. Good to be talking to everyone today.
Great, thank you for sharing your wisdom. And so, I mean, before we start chatting about NHS, I just touched on there, you've had a pretty interesting, varied career in different sectors. What are the biggest differences that you've seen between public, private and third sector?
I mean, I think it's almost what's more similar. I think the breadth of experience. I mean, it was interesting. I was at Pearson for, actually, it was 19 years. I had really varied jobs. So I did a stint at ft.com in the dot-com boom and bust, and I was at Penguin for a stint, which is traditional publishing. I worked in English language education as that was growing massively, and a whole load of digital transformation stuff, and also back office and enabling function transformation. So I think I did a lot at Pearson, and then and really varied, and then sort of took the view at sort of 40, what next? And then someone said, would you like to work for the Church of England? And I said, as an HR director, do they have one? And I am a person of faith, so it was sort of, you get those calls and you think, okay. And it was a cracking job. I mean, we met when I was there, Neil, and it was hugely freeing. But what was interesting, and then I went from there to Flybe because I live in Devon and I wanted to get home, basically, and I worked with pilots. And now I work in the NHS, and it's just huge. But what's really interesting is if you talk about academics or journalists or priests or pilots, you're talking with highly educated people who've invested an awful lot and very committed to what they do, hugely intelligent. And so actually your principles about things like engagement and how you work and customer experience, you take a lot of that skill across, and the digital transformation stuff has been incredibly useful. We might talk a bit about that later. But so actually, I think what I've come to realize is that breadth of experience actually gives you more confidence in your skill and what you should do, because people are people, and none of us people professionals would be in business if people weren't people, in all honesty. But human nature and what people need and want, and when there's issues, actually, whatever the context, you might change your approach, but what you need to do is often very similar.
That's really fascinating. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that. The sort of type of person and the complexity of the role and the similarities across those different things. I mean, particularly at the moment, some people would perhaps look at a Chief People Officer role in the NHS and think that's not for me. That sounds like a really hard task right now. What attracted you to that challenge?
Well, I've always believed in public service, and that sort of might have come through from some things I've done. And I put my hat in the ring for public office, and didn't get there, which is a blessing in disguise. But I guess when I was at Flybe, and obviously it was going through difficulties, which was really challenging actually, because when you're in a business that you think might be going under, and I was at the period where we thought it would, and then Virgin stepped in, and again, an amazing and awful experience to go through. But I got a call to say, would I like to go to the NHS? And it's interesting, as people know, when you've had your search, people ring you up and they go, and I've been contacted about the NHS a few times, and you go, do you really want someone who's not worked in the NHS? And they go, they really do. And I'd have one phone call with someone and they'd ask me a question about NHS terms and conditions. And I go, I know nothing about that. And you just got the feeling like, right, you're not going to get past. But this job, really interestingly, they were really clear. They wanted someone from outside the NHS. They wanted someone who could bring wider world expertise, that the people agenda was not where they needed it to be, and that the wider world was much further ahead. So actually, I had huge confidence in the people who recruited me, and this belief that I could do some good.
Yeah.
And the thing was that I started in August 19. And the NHS is massively complicated to get your head around. The governance, being hired from externally straight at board level in the NHS is pretty unheard of.
Yeah.
So that learning curve was massive. So I just about got my head agreed. I was going to Japan and New Zealand for my stepson's wedding, coming back, and then something called COVID happened, Neil, and we reinvented ourselves about once every 2 months, and what we had to do. So in a way, I was as green as anyone else in that. So I guess it took me a while to find my mojo, and actually, how can I bring that external experience to benefit? But I did a lot of people function transformation, digital transformation stuff, and a lot of that stuff. And really, it was just in Devon because there wasn't the capacity to work beyond Devon. But as we've come out of COVID and the NHS is really into transformation, I've really begun to use that wider world expertise beyond the bounds of Royal Devon. And I think one thing I'd say about the NHS is it's full of truly phenomenal people. Some of the most talented HR people I've ever worked with are here. Some of the most talented professionals, most integrity. I think what is difficult is the context in which we work, and the absolute unrelenting 24/7 nature makes actually transformational change quite difficult. But it is an amazing place, and I spent the other night just with our security guys going around and seeing what they were doing, and what a great bunch of people keeping people safe. And then another day you'll be with an amazing consultant who's pioneering a new technology with robotic surgery, and you'll go to one of our temporary sites and see what they're doing on vaccination, and it's just pretty mind-blowing.
Wow. So I mean, clearly you've touched on there pretty wide variety and scope of different roles. For people who don't work in the NHS, give us an idea of what does Royal Devon look like, and how does that fit within the wider NHS? How many people are there? You've already touched on it, from security guards to robotics and everything in between.
Yeah. So the NHS is massive, and I mean everyone knows, right? It's the fourth biggest employer in the world, depending on what you count and everything else. So just Royal Devon, which is effectively, to put it in plain terms, 2 acute hospitals. So that's 2 A&Es. That's and not every hospital does everything, but most do most things. So we have 2 acute hospitals. We have 22 community hospitals, and we have a load of community sites. We also operate the only Nightingale hospital that was used for COVID patients, but is now also completely repurposed to be a diagnostic centre and an orthopaedic centre. So we have, probably, if you count all the bits and pieces, around 50 or 60 sites in the Devon County Council area. And for those who haven't had the great opportunity to come to the fabulous part of the country that is Devon, and it is amazing. Our patch covers from the north coast to the east coast. It covers bits of Dartmoor, bits of Exmoor, and the geography is mad. 6 miles around here is a half-hour drive, often with where you're going, and that's where our patients are. Those are our customers. We're looking at our community workers. They have to go to so many different sites and places. And on top of that, we've got an aging population, so we have to think about how do we cater for those sorts of things. So I think the NHS considers itself to have 220 professions. Okay. And if you think people would be one profession, not 10 or 12 that we might say in our field. Yeah. And we have, from anything, as you'd imagine, HR, finance. We have some quite archaic terms. We talk about admin and clerical, which I'm desperately trying to get changed. And we talk about back office, not enabling functions. So all these things that are archaic. Healthcare scientists, research, yes, nurses, but there are so many different types of nurses, what we call allied health professionals. So you might think of physio, but there are 22 allied health professions. I'm looking out my window at the old Path Lab block, which is full of scientists. We have we do blood tests for most of the GPs in this part of Devon. And in terms of our employee base, about 15,000 people.
Wow.
So,
okay.
And I'm doing some work where I'm the Devon lead on some HR transformation work. When I'm looking at the employee base for that's 36,000 people. That's just the acute and the mental health provider, and some community workers in that. That's bigger than the Royal Navy, just that bit of Devon. And that is huge. And we're £1 billion. Just Royal Devon is £1 billion worth of revenue. So it's just huge.
It's a huge, diverse, and necessarily complex organization. So when you touched on when you started, that was right at the beginning of COVID as well. How do you looking back on how you got your head around that complexity and what your initial priorities were at the time? Do you look back on it and think, well, I wish I'd done A, B, or C, or I wish I hadn't done X, Y, or Z?
Not really. I'm not someone. I'm generally an optimist and I look forward. Of course, there are things I didn't do right, and getting my head around governance and what
Yeah.
the NHS means by assurance. Some of that is quite an anathema for people from outside. But I'm a pretty straight talker. You know that, and anyone who knows me knows that. So I just sort of did my thing, and I knew I'd been recruited to bring in difference. So I
Yep.
guess trying to remember what that difference was and be that difference. But I always take it at face value. People are there to try and help you succeed, not to help you fail. I think my boss, there was an interim lady called Julie who I stepped into her shoes. They've been really good at recognising I need support with people who really understood the NHS. So I had 2 posts supporting me who were people who would understand some of that NHS context. So I think, recognising that stuff early on, that you needed that support, and I guess it's the whole bit about good induction that we always say, but I was really welcomed, and I guess I do feel a sense of vocation. I do believe in public good, and I know I came here with that intent. So then you just got to take it on faith that if you think you have a professional skill, if you can think you bring something to the table, if you do that in good faith, then people respect that. And 4.5 years in, I'm very glad I did. I've learned a lot. I hope I've given a lot, and I always take the view if I can make through efficiency or improvement what I cost the taxpayer, then that's the aim, along with a lot of other things, but let's at least do that.
Let's start with that. Wow, 4.5 years already. You mentioned
having fun.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned Dartmoor, Exmoor, and sort of, Devon's a beautiful and large part of the country, and I guess with that beauty comes those challenges. How does that play into recruitment and retention, those geographical factors?
Yeah, so the reason that RDUH was created from what's called the Royal Devon and Exeter, and anyone who's been down here, RDUH is quite a well-known hospital, and it was North Devon District Healthcare Trust, and North Devon was in the NHS sort of high-risk area. It's the most remote hospital in England's mainland, and as a result has a lot of challenges, and of course it's hard to be efficient when you're very remote. So actually, if you want really good to get good safe services, you need a certain amount of volume. And some of the difficulties in a place like that is, how do you get enough experience in your clinicians to enable that volume? So there's a lot of reasons when the North Devon board approached the RD saying, could we go into what's called a collaborative agreement, which happened in about 2015, maybe 2014. Actually, maybe a bit later than that, but around about that sort of time. And some of the high risk areas were how we hadn't just not been able to recruit, and a lot of temporary measures. And if you read anything in the media now, the risk of temporary staff, not only expensive, you don't get that consistency of rotation, that sort of knowledge sharing, knowledge management. So it just creates risk. Now we've got better digitalization in records. Some of that stuff is reduced, but equally in any area where you've got a lot of temporary workforce, and when you think about that in healthcare, that can be tricky. So North Devon had done a lot of things to kind of hold it together, but not sustainable solutions. So part of a couple of things that we did as part of our discussions with the NHS about integrating what support we need is getting to the same EPR. So an EPR is an electronic patient record. So that's the equivalent of a customer database. But if you can imagine how complex patient databases are, that's just huge. That impacts every treatment pathway, every way into healthcare. So that was a big piece. So we needed them to be on the same EPR, and we needed support for that. And we needed them to fund some posts which were absolutely about those really difficult to hire in services, and where there was a particular level of risk. So we got a business case through for those things, and a couple of things we had to do. And we then did a lot of work, and it helped post-COVID that I think a lot of people thought about their life post-COVID and where they lived. And we saw quite a lot of exodus from big urban areas. So some people who maybe would have said, well, I don't want to move to sleepy Devon, were thinking, well, actually, maybe I do want to go to somewhere in Devon. We can do more by video and everything else. So that changed some of who was interested in us. But we did a whole load of projects on, we got some dedicated recruitment marketing. We used a whole load of online prospectuses for roles, really thought about selling Devon, selling the place. But we've done a project, I call it Recruitment Rocket Fuel, but it was really about really looking at what the private sector has done really quite well, which is attraction, candidate nurturing, really selling a role before even the opportunity is there, building database of candidates, building relationships with people who might be future candidates. We haven't been able to do loads of it. We've created a little team run by a fantastic lady called Emily called Executive and Specialist Search. So we're not using third parties. We're doing much more of that internal headhunting, direct sourcing, but doing it over time through the professional bodies, using our lead clinicians, really explaining to them that we needed you to invest some time in this recruitment process. If we get a name, you need to talk to them, because clinicians buy clinicians. The place is part of it, but the service is as important. So giving that opportunity to maybe do a couple of days on site, that's quite complicated with all our registrations and identity requirements and safeguarding requirements. How can you get someone just to do 2 days so they experience the team? So we've not done loads of it, Neil, but we've done a fair amount, and it's really worked. And we've got some really cracking hires. And it's a high risk if you're coming into a service where we want 4 or 5 consultants and we've got one. To recruit someone in, that feels quite risky to that recruit. So how do you put the safety around them, or give them the empowerment that we want you to find the other 2? So that you actually know they're building that team, and they want to build a team. Consultants are leaders. They are very senior qualified, very experienced people. They want a bit of empowerment and leadership and freedom, but you need to give them the support to come here in a way that they feel they'll be looked after and supported. And we also did a whole lot about family support, really thinking about relocation partners. Some of the stuff that, if anyone did international mobility, was normal. We don't nearly normally do it in the UK, but we've done quite a lot of it domestically for UK hires, so they feel welcomed and able to move to Devon. And some of our geography, second homes is a problem. Helping them find a house is also an issue. So all of that stuff to sell the package.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds firstly phenomenal, very joined up in terms of how you're working with those different teams and looking at everything, sort of end to end. I'm glad you brought up the international side of things and relocating people into the region. We know that across care and across the NHS, an increasing part of the workforce is international, and it's in the media a lot at the moment. How important is that ability to hire internationally, and is that becoming more difficult as we're competing with other countries around the globe for talent?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. So it is becoming more difficult because post-COVID, there's a lot of challenges in Western healthcare, but actually in any country's healthcare about workforce. But I also think, the bit to say, Neil, and colleagues who are interested in this will maybe want to look at, but there's an ethical issue, which actually the NHS has to be quite careful about. So there's an ethical recruitment policy, and that's quite tricky to navigate. It's not tricky to navigate because it's entirely right. But you will have people who are telling you that they can provide candidates who are sourced ethically when sometimes we're not sure they are. So you have to sort of look out for that. So there's the ethical question of actually we cannot deplete the developing world's healthcare workforce. That's not morally right. And equally, from a UK point of view, it's from social mobility, from inclusion. Devon has some of really, really poor coastal deprivation areas. So we should be really looking at growing our own. So there's a real balance. We have done a lot of international recruitment, and Devon's got an international recruitment hub run by the NHS, which has done great things. And we have recruited many people. Actually, in RD&E, we've got communities going back 20 or 30 years of international hires. So it's not new, but the volume and pace is new. And what has particularly changed post-COVID is the mix coming in. So historically, you would often focus on one geography, and you bring in a cohort of people together, which gave a group of people moving to this country a connection which had the same cultural heritage as they did. What's happened latterly is you get a really mixed cohort coming from 4 or 5 countries. And of course, if I'm someone who grew up in southern India and I meet someone who's grown up in the Caribbean, I know, the bit about coming to the UK is hard enough. Actually, I've never, come across someone, I may never have worked with someone who has that cultural heritage. So you have to do a lot of intracultural understanding, as well as, hey, you're moving somewhere new and how do we make you feel welcome? And Devon is not the most diverse part of the UK. Everyone, I'm sure, knows that. So we usually have more diversity than the local. Well, we do have more diversity than the local population. So we have to also really try and support that sort of cultural cohesion, cultural support piece, pastoral support. So there's been a lot of additional pastoral support being funded in the NHS to support the international workforce. But one of the difficulties we have, and this speaks to the long-term workforce plan that people may have read about, is that because the NHS funding-wise, while some things are funded long-term, we really have to go year to year with the sort of demands and pressures that we're operating under. It's really hard to make the money stack up each year with the demands increasing. So in year, it'll be look cheaper for us to have an international hire than it will for us to have an apprentice, because we've got someone who's ready trained. Yes, they have to do their certain amount of UK normalization. They have to pass a qualification within the UK when they get here. They have to make sure they get the language tests covered before they can practice fully on a ward. But that takes about 3 to 4 months. So we have some one-off costs attached to all of that, but then they're a fully functioning member of our staff.
Yeah.
Obviously, apprentice, it takes us 3 to 4 years maybe, but also a lot of our apprenticeships work on about 40% on off the job. So we're used to, in mining world, 20% off the job. A lot of the clinical areas, it's 40% off the job, which in a rostered environment, if you can imagine, if you're a team and you're paying for a whole time equivalent, but actually lose them for 40%, and you're working in an environment where you have mandatory staffing levels, you have rosters you have to fill, you have high demand, that's really tricky to absorb, that capacity loss. So one of the real challenges we have to think about is what's that balance of a good amount of international hire and other professions and medics, and getting that right, getting that welcome and support right, but also how do we get a more sustainable route to growing our own?
Yeah.
And part of the long-term workforce plan is about that.
But that long-term workforce plan you mentioned, so this was it was the NHS long-term workforce plan. It was unveiled in June 2023 with the 3 core areas of train, retain, and reform. Is the one of those? I mean, all 3 clearly are important, and you have to balance all of these things. Is the one of those that's your sort of top priority?
Well, I mean, they all have to be a priority, and this is the difficulty at the NHS is we are always juggling multi priorities. And I think, someone said to me, what you're good is you learn to move forward in treacle. That's what you taught me, because you can move forward in treacle, and that's sort of what we have to do.
Yeah.
Because, everyone always talks about, rebuilding the aircraft whilst you're moving. But if you think about the NHS, we're operating often at more than 100% capacity, 365 days of the year. There is no let up. So getting smarter about how you work. So retain is really important. And actually, the long-term workforce plan does not work if we do not retain better.
Yeah.
And there's a fantastic bit of work, and this is where people may not always think to look to the NHS for good stuff. Let's look at the People Promise. Look it up. It's fantastic. It's what we call our EVP within Royal Devon. Different trusts using it differently, but really our EVP. I explain that to our boarders. What we want most of our people to feel most of the time is the People Promise, and it's a really lovely way of saying this is our commitments to all of you.
Yeah.
So we are trying to do a load of work on what does the People Promise look like, and how do we retain people, and that's got a bit about safe and healthy, that's got a bit about learning, it's got a bit about included and various other things, but it's a really nice tool. So retain is really important, but that's sort of got to be the bread and butter. We've had retention work, we have what we call a culture development roadmap. I don't use the term OD because in the NHS I think it's really misused. So I use the word cultural development. That sits in my portfolio, and we connect wellbeing, employee experience, and inclusion as one area. And we deliver a whole load of work, which includes patient safety, includes transformation, and that's in our cultural development roadmap. And that's how we will deliver the People Promise to our colleagues. But workforce reform is really important, and that's about new and different roles. We simply cannot train most of what we need through the existing workforce. And new roles, if you look at prevention, if you look at how do we enable people to stay at home rather than come to hospital when they're at end of life, if you look at things like we should only really be paying a senior doctor something a senior doctor can do. So there's a huge amount on new roles and workforce reform. If you think about diagnostics and science and new science, so all of that stuff. So reforming is massively important. And then recruitment, building that pipeline. And the long-term, just to give you an idea of numbers, the long-term workforce plan, it's £2.4 billion worth of investment across the NHS over 5 years, but it's a 15-year work plan, which is based on the demands of healthcare within the NHS. Expects the workforce to grow from 1.4 million now to 2.3 million by 2038.
Wow, that's incredible.
And we need the people function to stay flat in its growth for that to be affordable. So then it's how do we as a people function enable that and work smarter, because we can't do any more. Our people function is exhausted, post-COVID, as is our finance, as is our digital, alongside our clinical workforce as well.
So you mentioned there the sort of the exhaustion. You talked about well-being being one of the things within your portfolio. We've all got friends and family in the NHS, and we read about how stressful it can be, and particularly when there's a lack of staff. And you mentioned having shifts that have to be staffed to a certain level. How do you go about tackling that as a chief people officer in terms of this sort of what sounds like a sort of relentless challenge. How do you keep yourself and the team going?
Well, so first of all, you've got to trust your colleagues. And one of our values in our trust is empowerment. And that sounds a bit odd, but one of the things that COVID clinicians really felt was empowered. And that's quite hard to do because, if you look at what's in the media, something like the Lepley inquiry, you can just see, for example, regulation for NHS managers coming in. Right now, I would tell you, I think I'm pretty regulated already, and I think I could go to jail for a number of things, and I'm really clear on that. That comes with the territory. But I think that there are some awful things that have gone on, which result in more and more governance and assurance and scrutiny, and that's not a bad thing. A lot of that is really good, and it's necessary and it's important. But you've also got to allow enough freedom to trust people. That and we've done a lot of work on just and learning culture, which has come from aviation, funny enough. But the NHS has started to work more and more, where we've got to get into that process. It's not it's what went wrong and why did it go wrong, because you cannot get it right all the time in the NHS. You just can't, because it's human beings, it's humans' lives, and there's a lot of medicine which is, and you have to assess the best you can at a time and place. So in terms of how do we manage all those things, is you've got to trust colleagues. There's a huge amount of people responsibility in our chief medical officers, our chief nursing officers. There are a lot of tools and techniques to manage that. But actually, it's really looking at that stuff that we all know as people professionals. But what is the cost-benefit analysis of people not being sick? How can you invest in occupational health? That sense of team that actually breaks become really important. Our clinicians come to work for your patients. They don't come to work to do admin. They want to be there. They don't mind doing the difficult patient stuff. They don't mind having to break bad. Well, it's difficult breaking bad news, but that's the job. They get that. What they don't want to do is be doing things that they feel is a waste of their time, and they don't understand why they're doing them.
Filling in forms in triplicate.
Yes, and that's for the digital stuff. And when I look at HR transformation, we are incredibly manual. We do so many word attachments to emails. And a lot of the digital systems designed for the NHS are behind the rest of the world. It's why you're at TriPad of you are beginning to enter the NHS market, aren't you? But it's a hard one to break into because you've got a lot of players who are very good at understanding the NHS, but actually maybe aren't really thinking about recruitment in the wider world. And out of our 2,000 hires in the last year, half of them have come from the general population, not from existing clinical staff. So this idea we've got to design everything for the NHS when we think about recruitment, we've got to design it for the 16-year-olds at college.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the other thing I would say, just on the pressures, so lots of jobs in lots of places have become more difficult post-COVID. I think there's an important piece to say about apprenticeships, and you're in a world where people are used to things coming through degrees and degree type qualifications, and there are degree apprenticeships, many of them in the NHS. But there is something about the NHS route, which is, and the apprenticeship route, which builds resilience, because people learn as they learn, but they also learn the trade and the craft in role in situ, so it's not a surprise. And it's completely grounded. And I always remember when I was at Flybe, one of the chief technical officers who ran the hangar and all the engineering, and saying to me that actually they found the engineering apprentices were much safer than the degree engineers who came through, who they had to do years conversion to get them hangar ready. But they hadn't grown up with the disciplines around safety and protocol. So
that's really interesting.
There's something about apprenticeship routes, which I, as someone who's come from outside the NHS, I've seen, and I talk about that quite a lot. And it's a bit of a surprise because so much of medical education and all those things came through degree routes, pure degree routes.
I think, certainly across different sectors, we're seeing more and more employers favouring those workplace apprenticeships, where, as you say, you learn and earn. I think it's really interesting what you're saying as well about safety in the aviation industry and how that's seeping in. I'd imagine that's another advantage for you, having been in that industry. One thing you mentioned earlier was around people looking to the NHS for and public sector for innovation. One of the things that we definitely see the pattern of is government organisations tend to be leaders in certain areas, around compliance, for example, but also around DE&I. So balanced interview panels, anonymous applications, sort of diversity and inclusion passports, that sort of thing is sort of being developed in the public sector and then tend to seep out into the private sector as sort of best practice. Are there other things that you have seen since you've been in the NHS that you haven't seen perhaps in private sector, where you think, well, actually everybody should be doing this? We're at the forefront here.
Yeah, so it's so I think that professional empowerment piece is really interesting, and I think there are some things around governance and assurance that I've learned about, and the risk of false assurance and how much you take on paper. I think the slight difficulty is the way that's done is quite inaccessible. I'm dyslexic. I'm very open that I'm dyslexic, and I just couldn't believe in that paper. If I tell you most board packs are about 400 pages, that gives you an idea of
Oh my God.
the amount of reading. I didn't wear glasses when I started, but then I talked about, actually, we talk a lot about accessibility. So I think there is a lot around the NHS, and that bit about that embedded understanding of well-being in the workplace, and the one which comes from aviation as well, but we talk an awful lot about psychological safety, and I think that is something that has not really been talked about, but the links to culture. We had a workshop about safety with clinicians about who've been involved in difficult instances and what could we learn about it. And what was really interesting is you could talk about busyness and pressure, and yes, they might be contributing factors, but the biggest thing to them was culture. And the culture, and actually could there, in a theatre environment, could a junior person speak out and say, and how do we create the culture that actually means? We talk a lot about speaking out. The NHS has something called Freedom to Speak Out Guardians, which was nationally imposed after one of the reviews a few years ago, and I was like, why do you need a Freedom to Speak Out Guide? I don't get it. Just people should. But there is a whole load of stuff about professional barriers. There's a whole load of stuff about cultural barriers. There's a whole load of stuff about procedures where everyone assumes the person who's most senior or most qualified knows exactly what they're doing. And of course, patient safety and clinical safety is absolutely about everyone in the room knowing what they're needing to do and calling out if something that's meant to happen hasn't happened. And you can't rely on the lead clinician being the only person who's got eyes on that. And so there's something about that psychological safety, that environment, and integrity and honesty, which absolutely comes to the core of people who work in the NHS, which I think we can learn from. I think the bits that sort of surprised me is some of the things where on inclusion, even though it's the massively diverse environment and more diverse than most of the civil service in those areas, and then the NHS is often behind, and in a lot, be it digital or diversity in those areas. And I think for me, that often comes is because people take that, they must have NHS experience. And what you do is you end up just promoting people where there's no one to train them. So in a lot of those areas, which maybe have emerged over the last 10, 20 years, HRS being a classic, actually you get hugely willing and able people who say, well, they're really good, we'll promote them to do inclusion, but they haven't actually done inclusion. They're a very, very bright and effective ally, but actually they haven't done the hard yards of the work. So I talk a lot about, actually you must bring in expertise from outside. If you don't have it already, you can't train someone to lead if you haven't got someone with the expertise to train them. And some of our recruitment and financial challenges and headcount reductions in enabling functions and in corporate functions means that we end up putting highly qualified professionals into areas that they are not qualified in.
That does sound like a challenge that perhaps leaders in all kinds of industries face. But very, very interesting. The NHS growing from, I think you said, was it 1.4 million to 2.2 by 2038. But you've got to keep your people function flat. Obviously, as a technology guy, I'm bound to say this, but that screams out that you're going to have to find ways to be more efficient and more effective. You've mentioned about the paperwork, and 400-page board pack just sounds madness to me. But anyway, so how are you looking? Firstly within your own sphere, but then perhaps more widely as well. What role do you think technology is going to have to play?
So it's massive, and it's massive in the clinical area, and it's also massive in the enabling functions area. And of course, it's already there to an extent, but how good is it and how connected it is the problem. So we at RUH have one of the EPR's electronic patient record systems. We've chosen the real Rolls-Royce one, the absolutely, fantastic, and trying to drive that across, and that's a huge piece of it. The bizarre thing from a digital point of view in the NHS is, so the NHS, people might remember failed NHS IT projects nationally, but there was one which was really successful, which was a national HR database. It's called ESR, New Service Record. I think it's one of the biggest HR systems in the world because of the number of people on it. But it was built for the NHS, And ironically, though, it's been put into splendid digital isolation from the wider data and information architecture, which is, I coming in, I'm going like, hang on, you've got one HR database for the whole of the NHS, and it's diced and spliced and used in many different ways, and what you can do with it and everything else. So there was this history of the NHS of segregating organisations, sort of getting a bit of internal market, which has created some really inappropriate segregation. So I've come in with my hat, be it the Church of England on National Clergy Database, or at Pearson, where we've got 42 different, in those projects where we've got different countries to get onto one employee record system, and creating those processes. So that's one of the backgrounds I brought, which I think now is absolutely helping the NHS along with other people. So we're a national vanguard that's called People Digital in Devon.
Yeah.
I'm the SRO for that work, but that's absolutely about interoperability. And ESR is remarkable. You'll know this well, Neil. Its lack of interoperability is notable, to say the least. And actually, there's a new ESR being processed at the moment, and I'm involved in the procurement of that. So that background in digital transformation, both in the organisations I am, but also in the enabling functions, and particularly the people function, is absolutely now what I'm spending probably 20-30% of my time helping input into the NHS, leading work in Devon, but also to that national piece. And I spend a lot of time saying, why is our workforce information architecture so completely disconnected from our wider digital architecture? It's a big old steamship to turn around that one, but the understanding that needs to happen. When you think about it, here we are, while ESR is not connected to the electronic patient record, and whilst if you think about, and there's an important line, because when an employee is a patient, that's a different thing entirely.
Yeah.
But equally, knowing where someone is rostered and being able to pre-fill forms or all of those sorts of things, so that actually when they're making a note, yes, they're audited on their login, but doing some really smart reporting about cost per bed, per procedure, whatever.
Yeah.
With the staffing cost, we can't do any of that stuff. The MI doesn't allow it until we get data lakes and some of that real master data work done. But that's what we're trying to do. But that's the bit that a lot of folk in there just don't know how much we have to do yet. But then there's a national team working on it who are fantastic, and they've got some really smart brains in there, and I guess I'm one of their guinea pigs.
Well, Hannah, as one of the guinea pigs, we know you're an incredibly optimistic, resilient, driven person, and you've got some amazing challenges there. And I guess we all have a stake in that future of our friends, our family, our health. And it sounds like you're doing an incredible job there in an incredible organisation. Thank you very, very much for chatting with us today. I think there's loads of stuff that people can take out, find interesting, and find inspiration from. So Hannah, thank you so much for sharing with us.
It's an absolute pleasure, Neil, and I've enjoyed it too. I think I've done so much reflection in a while, so thank you very much.
Excellent. Thanks very much. My thanks to Hannah Foster from Royal Devon University Hospitals NHS Trust. Really loved speaking with her today, and she had some fascinating insights to share. For more insights and wisdom on recruitment, people and purpose, subscribe to The View, and why not tell a friend? Thanks for joining us.